Hi, my name's Phil and I like discussing politics and, well, we've had another vote where the government's been defeated today. It was really weird. I was just talking about this last night. And this was really impromptu. No, I wasn't expecting this. I did not know anything about this. What has basically happened, I want to really talk about what the consequences of this are for the vote next week. But just a couple of things first of all. So the European Withdrawal Act, well, I suppose did mean that if next Tuesday when the vote takes place, the deal was defeated, as was widely expected, the Prime Minister can go away for 2 weeks and and ah about it before coming back with another plan where she'd have to say to the House, I have this other plan. Or she could come back and say, I have the same plan, I'm going to let you vote on it again. That would have been fine too. But she'd have had 2 weeks of letting them sweat a bit more. And remember, her plan A, is to make MPs sweat to such an extent that they really believe exactly what she's saying, that it's this deal or no deal. And that may be true, but that is definitely what she wants to get out of them. But the thing is, a lot of MPs don't necessarily believe that. But what caused a lot of consternation with this is there was an amendment to that act that was proposed with cross-party support. It wasn't just opposition MPs. In fact, it was Tory rebels that really spearheaded it. And what it means is, instead of her being able to go off for 2 weeks and do this, she has 3 days. So the vote is next Tuesday. I guess what that means is she has to come back by the end of that week. That's what this will mean. Now, the chief whip, who's the person who sort of directs their party to how to vote for the Conservatives, was furious at this. From their point of view, they thought that the government could just railroad this through, and that they could, someone wants to propose an amendment, the government could just say, no, we're not doing that. Because they basically had the power to deny anyone any debating time. So there was no time given in Parliament to debate this amendment, and they thought that was enough. But the Speaker of the House decided that it could go up for a vote. And there's quite a few Conservative MPs quite furious about this. But really what they're furious about is the fact that the Speaker has allowed Parliament to vote on an issue. Now, I could quite understand it if he lets all sorts of amendments go to a vote and those amendments are defeated every time. Yes, you can say to the Speaker, look, you're wasting Parliament's time here with these frivolous amendments. But this was one that clearly had a lot of support. But I mean, he's actually stuck his neck out. I mean, good man. And this wasn't a leave or remain situation either, by the way. There is just as many leavers who wanted this as remainers. Remember, I suppose the only ones who would have been quite happy for Theresa May to have spent a full 2 weeks would be those who want a no-deal Brexit, such as Jacob Rees-Mogg, who of course stand to make a massive fortune if we crash out because of short-selling sterling, of course. And but for the majority of other MPs. But what I think the real consequence of this is, because again, just like last night, you could argue it's a relatively minor point. Instead of her being able to go away for 2 weeks and then come back and say what she's going to do, they just give her 3 days. But it doesn't necessarily alter the end result. The Prime Minister today reiterated multiple times that it's this deal or no deal, and she has the power to enforce that. Although the wider Parliament defeating this deal may well say to her, look, you have got to come back with something else. She doesn't have to. She doesn't have to. As she pointed out, and as others have pointed out, although MPs are saying that they voted last night for no deal being unacceptable, the fact is that the reality of the situation, that's just making their feelings known. The reality of the situation is effectively Parliament voted for no deal by voting through the European Withdrawal Act. All parties, well, at least Labour and the Conservatives, plenty enough MPs voted in favour of that to get it through. And it was understood at that time that the choice was basically between whatever deal, which was not known at the time, but whatever deal the government could come up with, or that there would be no deal. But this vote, which again was quite narrow, it wasn't a huge defeat of the government, but it was slightly bigger than last night's. What it tells me is, because I think to myself, okay, this amendment does no good at all unless the deal is voted down next week. If that deal is torpedoed, then that's when it comes into effect. So that's Parliament basically saying, you've wasted enough time, you're not wasting any more, we're going to give you 3 days and that's it. If you believed that the deal was going to pass, then you wouldn't bother with it because it doesn't matter. If the deal passes, then that's it. It's all done with. It's finished. So, and I know obviously everyone kept saying, you know, MPs in particular, they're the people to listen to actually right at this moment, which is a strange thing to say, but they are the people who have the best view of how things are actually going to go. If MPs were going to vote the deal in, which was not completely impossible, because, you know, if Theresa May does convince them all, it's no deal, which everyone is, well, apart from the ones who are going to get rich out of it, dead against, or this deal, actually, you might find a majority of MPs would go, well, this deal is better than no deal. But obviously, the vote today tells me that they don't believe that they believe that there is an alternative. Not that they believe no deal is better, but that they believe that actually if Theresa May was really forced into it, she'd come back with something else. There were a couple of very interesting things said by some MPs there, because obviously a lot of MPs been interviewed by various news organisations, and a couple of them said something quite interesting. They said that, and these are people who've been MPs for a long time, they've been in Parliament quite a long time, decades, and they said they've never seen so much cross-party support as they're seeing now. Which, of course, makes sense because this is a very serious issue for the country, and the MPs know full well the severity of the actions. And it's not even about, I know a number of MPs have sort of talked about the fact that if we do crash out with no deal, the government will be blamed as living standards plummet. But it goes beyond that. There's a real feeling that it just goes beyond blame, that something needs to be done. But what that is anyone's guess. Like I've already said before, if the Prime Minister stands firm, there's really nothing anyone can do, even the collective will of Parliament, because Parliament at the moment has no collective will. Although it has a majority saying we're not happy with what the government's doing and we do not want a no deal, granted, that's a consensus on what Parliament doesn't want. There is no consensus on what Parliament does want. What are the options? The options are May's deal. There isn't a majority in favour of that. No deal. There certainly isn't a majority in favour of that. Another referendum. There isn't a majority in favour of that. Swapping to what might be hastily rearranged as an alternative deal is like the Norway deal, where we basically remain in the single market. There isn't a majority, as far as I can tell, in favour of that. And even then, the Prime Minister would have to get on board with it. And what someone else said, which was also quite interesting, is it might depend, the Prime Minister's behaviour after it may well depend on the scale of the defeat. You know, I think there's an awful lot of MPs now really honestly believe that this is going to be defeated. No one's seriously suggesting that it's going to pass through. The only person I've actually heard say that it's going to pass through is Ian Duncan Smith, and I did use the word seriously, so we can ignore that. Even the Prime Minister is still just urging people to vote for it by saying, well, if you're against no deal, well, the way to avoid no deal is quite easy. Vote on my deal. So it just... There is no consensus for any outcome, and that is the problem. At the moment, Parliament's making quite clear what it doesn't want, but there is no consensus on what it does want. And so I see no good results out of this either, of course. And going back, just to sort of finish off here about the Speaker, John Bercow, and again, all the sort of complaints that were going. I mean, I know a number of Conservative MPs who were not at all appreciative of this amendment, even if it was one of or two of their own number that sort of spearheaded it. The thing is, something like this is actually inevitable at the moment. A number of them are sort of talking about the fact it's fairly unprecedented for this sort of thing to happen, as if he's done something that's wildly against, you know, the confines of his office. But the reality is, things like this are inevitable because you've got a perfect storm of several things happening. The first thing is the government does not have a majority. Now, there are a number of countries around the world, indeed there are several in Europe, where it is quite common for no party to have an overall majority in their parliament. And so those countries are used to doing deals, arranging coalitions, even quid pro quo deals on votes and things like that. You know, they're very skilled at such matters. They're used to it. It's part of the culture. That's not the case in Britain, even though for most of the last 8 years, we've had coalition governments, we've had minority governments. The fact is that we're not used to it. In fact, in 2010, when we had a coalition government, when no individual party won more than 50% of the seats in Parliament, that was the first time I had seen that in my life. You know, there's been various times in the past when it had been talked about, but it had never happened. In fact, ironically, I remember in 1992 where it was being talked about, and then it was a landslide to the Conservative government at the time. It's quite spectacular. So we are not used to it, and the MPs, basically MPs behave, I think, as they've been used to, which is that governments have a healthy majority and therefore get to push legislation through. You know, you don't get these spontaneous little votes popping up in Parliament. But the fact of the matter is, if you're not going to have a majority, these things are going to happen. The second thing, of course, that's causing it is the fact that this is the most dangerous time. I mean, Brexit is, whether you're in favour of it or against it, it is the most serious change to the country possibly ever, you know, in terms of democratic history. It is quite spectacular how serious this is and how little time. So inevitably, again, you know, you're not going to have MPs patiently sitting down and going, well, you know, there's not much we can do. They're testing it all. They're testing it all the time, because I think the attitude now is, well, what is there to lose? So they'll be proposing amendments left, right and centre to little bits of legislation, not one of which is going to make sweeping changes to the power of the government. The government still controls the whole process, really. But it's just a way of making them a little bit uncomfortable, perhaps, because potentially, just as Theresa May is hoping she can make the MPs sweat and say, well, look, my deal's not so bad after all, is it? At the same time, I think Parliament's trying to make her sweat and say, you know, you've already suffered more defeats than any Prime Minister we can remember in such a short time as well. And they're going to keep coming. They are going to keep coming. And of course, I suppose another part of this perfect storm is the fact that there are so many ways in which this could be done, and it was never made clear in the original referendum how it should be done. And that, I think, ultimately is the biggest problem of all. It's all right, people saying, oh, we should do this to enforce the will of the people. We should do this to enforce the will of the people. The will of the people in that referendum was to leave the EU. There are so many ways to leave the EU. This is like the most extreme way to leave the EU. You know, we could have just left the EU on the Norway deal, which I keep reminding people is exactly what Nigel Farage was talking about. That's what he suggested we do. Obviously, he changed his mind immediately after the result, but that's what he suggested. In fact, all of the Leave campaigners were all saying, of course, we're going to stay in the single market. It would be madness not to be in the single market. Of course, we're going to stay in that. Day after the referendum, oh, no, we've got to leave the single market. People said so, didn't they? So, yeah, there's so many different ways to leave the EU that would have complied with the referendum result. And we're opting for the most extreme form. Of course, that's going to invite a lot of like resentment in Parliament. And now they're making that known, you know, because, as I say, it's just a combination of very serious moments in our history. There's no clear direction from the people because the referendum was written by a retard, or in more likelihood, just someone who was so arrogant they really didn't believe Leave was going to win, you know. And the fact that the Prime Minister has no control over Parliament. Most Prime Ministers do. They have a healthy majority. That gives them control. And that's not happening. So I'm now looking at it. I was thinking to myself, I didn't think it was a 50-50 next week. I thought it was likely to be a defeat, and then maybe she'd come back a couple of weeks later with the same deal and really make them sweat, and maybe it would get through. Now I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, with this vote, it's not going through next week. I cannot, I can never say 0% chance of it going through because that's just mad. But there is no sense in this vote today if it was going to go through. And the fact that you had so many people, there was a majority, in fact, voting for the amendment, would strongly suggest that that majority at least are going to vote against it. Not approve, but suggest. And even some of the ones who voted against the amendment, a lot of those you would imagine were people voting against it just because of the principle of mucking about with legislation in this way. And maybe a good healthy number of those would still vote against the deal themselves. They just didn't want this amendment to go through. So I'm now looking at it and thinking there's got to be 0.1% chance that this deal would be accepted. Now I'm basically going to say it's gone. It has been torpedoed. And by the end of next week, Theresa May has got to say what she's going to do about it. And another thing, of course, although this was known yesterday, Jeremy Corbyn has said, although I'm still not sure that it would succeed, he has said if the deal is rejected, he'll call a vote of no confidence in the government. Whether that would succeed or not, I don't know. I don't think it would help, even though obviously I'm a Labour supporter. Of course I would want a Labour government in, and therefore when a Labour government isn't in power, of course I want general elections every day if possible until it happens. But the reality is a general election result would come through after exit day. What we need right now is action to avoid the no deal. Just last little thing I'll say, this is probably the third last little thing I'll say. Theresa May kept saying to Jeremy Corbyn, unfortunately, I don't think he's brilliant at debating these things, so it was easy to trap him. But she basically said, you keep saying you're against no deal, but you don't want to vote for my deal, so what's your idea then? And that is the problem. No single... Well, there hasn't actually been an alternative suggested, as far as I can tell. The only suggestion, the alternative suggestion, of course, Norway deal, but I actually don't know if they... It sounds like it'd be quite quick and easy because we're already in the single market. You know, could we just say to the EU, do you know what? Can we just leave everything apart? Just stay in the single market. The problem then is, you know, you're still gonna piss off a load of leavers, even though you'll have done exactly what they say. I mean, I would say to hell with it. But, you know, obviously I'm a Remainer, and no one's come up with an idea that has the support of Parliament. And one MP was suggesting today that because of this, that actually would be a reason to go to do another referendum. She says, because there is an impasse in Parliament, Parliament cannot agree on any outcome that is feasible. There is no outcome that Parliament agrees on. So that would be a reason itself to go to the polls again, to go to the people and say, look, May's deal, you can vote for that if you want. In her, what she actually said is you can either have May's deal or you can have the to remain on the current terms, which is member of the EU. I would always argue that obviously that would be great, but I would always argue that I think there should still be two questions. I think there should be, do we stay in the EU or do we leave the EU? Are you still sure you want to leave the EU? But then ask the second question that always should have been asked in the first place. Do you accept the deal that has been agreed between the UK government and the EU? Or should we leave with no deal? Or should we leave with staying in the single market but leaving the other mechanisms, which might be on the table if people really tried with the time left? You know, put that there, because that way, because, you know, as much as, of course, I think it's dangerous to do anything other than stay in the EU, we have to be fair. If you are convinced that leaving is a good idea and that leaving under no deal is acceptable, then those people should have that say as well. You know, so we all know who to blame if it happens. And you know, that seems perfectly fair to me. But, you know, there is no consensus in Parliament. And when there is no consensus in Parliament, one of two things happens. Normally a general election, but there isn't time. So, you know, calling a general election would basically be to say no deal, that Parliament doesn't want that. So in actual fact, a referendum is now the only possibility. But they have to move quickly. So what I'm hoping for is not only does the deal get voted down next week, but it gets completely sunk by such a large majority that she cannot even hope to bring it back to the House for another vote, that she has to do something else. And because she's only got 3 days to say what that something else is, maybe she will actually concede that another vote has to be done. To the people. People's vote. Another referendum, whatever you want to call it. So there you go. Another interesting, nay, exciting day in Parliament. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below, of course, as always. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content, click the bell notification, share with others who might also be interested. And let's face it, who isn't interested in politics? Can't say words today. And until next time, I'll see you later.